Sophie Carter tightened her grip on the stack of files in her hands as she walked briskly through the grand marble-floored lobby of Harrison Enterprises. The high-end corporate office gleamed under the glow of expensive chandeliers, a silent testament to the wealth and power of those who worked here. The men in tailored suits and women in designer heels barely noticed her presence, too consumed with their own importance. She had learned long ago that people like her, people who worked hard just to get by, were invisible to them. At 27, Sophie had already seen enough of life's struggles to know that kindness was rare in places like this. She worked as a receptionist, taking extra shifts whenever possible to support her younger sister, Lily, who was still in university. Their parents were gone, and Sophie had shouldered the responsibility of raising her sister with no complaints. No matter how exhausted she was, she kept going, because she had no choice. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of muffled laughter coming from the far end of the lobby. She turned her head and immediately felt her stomach twist. A group of junior executives stood near the cleaning supply closet, their expensive watches glinting under the lights. They were laughing at something, or rather, someone. Sophie's heart sank when she saw what was happening. Margaret Hayes, the elderly janitor, was on her hands and knees, picking up trash that had been deliberately spilled across the floor. A woman in designer heels nudged a crumpled piece of paper toward Margaret with the toe of her shoe. "Come on, Grandma," she sneered. "You missed a spot." Margaret didn't respond. She simply kept picking up the trash, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly. Sophie clenched her jaw. She had known Margaret for a while now. The older woman was quiet, kind, and never complained despite the long hours she worked. Sophie often stayed late just to chat with her. She had learned that Margaret had no family left and worked the night shift because she couldn't afford to retire. The sight of her being humiliated like this was unbearable. Taking a deep breath, Sophie stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" Her voice was firm, cutting through the laughter. The group turned to look at her, clearly surprised that someone had dared to interrupt them. "Not at all," the woman in heels said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Margaret was just doing her job. Sophie crossed her arms. "And is it also part of her job to be mocked while she does it?" One of the men scoffed. "Why do you care? She's just a janitor." Sophie felt anger rise in her chest. She knelt beside Margaret and started picking up the scattered trash with her. "Because she's a human being," she said sharply. "And unlike some people, she actually contributes something meaningful." Margaret looked at Sophie, her lips parting in surprise. The executives exchanged glances. Their amusement had turned into annoyance. They clearly didn't expect anyone to challenge them. But Sophie didn't care. "Maybe you should be careful," the woman in heels said with a smirk. "People who make trouble don't last long around here." Sophie met her gaze without flinching. "Maybe people like you should learn some decency." The woman narrowed her eyes but didn't reply. A few moments later, the group walked away, muttering under their breath. Sophie turned back to Margaret and helped her to her feet. "Are you okay?" Margaret dusted off her uniform and gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, dear. But you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Sophie replied, handing Margaret a bottle of water from her bag. "People like that will never understand what real strength looks like." Margaret studied her for a moment before nodding. "You remind me of someone I once knew." Before Sophie could ask what she meant, the intercom crackled to life, summoning her back to the front desk. With one last reassuring smile, she patted Margaret's arm and hurried away. What she didn't know was that the entire scene had been captured by a hidden security camera. That night, Daniel Harrison sat in his penthouse office, reviewing the day's reports. The city skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed. At 32, he had built an empire in the real estate industry, turning Harrison Enterprises into one of the most successful luxury property firms in the country. He had everything: wealth, power, influence, but none of it meant anything. His father had raised him to be ruthless, to never show weakness, and to trust no one. His mother, Evelyn Hayes, had disappeared from his life when he was a child. The only thing she had left behind was the lesson that people only stayed when it was convenient for them. Daniel sighed and rubbed his temples. Sleep never came easily for him, so he often distracted himself with work. That was when a notification popped up on his screen: security footage review. One of his assistants had flagged something from earlier in the day. With nothing better to do, he clicked on it. The screen filled with grainy footage of the lobby. He saw the group of executives standing over a janitor, laughing. His jaw tightened. Then, a woman stepped forward. Daniel leaned in, watching as Sophie Carter put herself between the janitor and the bullies. She was fearless. She did not hesitate to speak up, even when she had nothing to gain. Daniel replayed the footage several times. There was something about Sophie that unsettled him, something that stirred memories he had long buried. He shut off the screen and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Who exactly was Sophie Carter? And why did she remind him of something he had lost a long time ago? The next morning, Sophie arrived at work early, just as she always did. But something felt different. The air in the building was tense. People whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances as she passed by. She had no idea what was going on, until she reached her desk and saw the email waiting for her. Subject: CEO meeting, immediate attendance required. Sophie's stomach twisted. She had never spoken to Daniel Harrison before. He was a ghost in his own company, rarely seen by lower-level employees. The only thing people knew about him was that he was ruthless in business and completely unreachable on a personal level. Why would he want to see her? Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her blouse and made her way to the top floor. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. When the doors opened, she was met with a cold, modern office space. A tall man stood by the window, his back to her. "Come in." His voice was deep, controlled. Sophie stepped inside, her heart pounding. Daniel turned around. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Neither of them spoke. Then, he tilted his head slightly and said, "Tell me, Miss Carter, do you always make a habit of standing up to people who could ruin your career?" Sophie swallowed hard. She had no idea that standing up for an elderly janitor was about to change her life forever.